Hello everyone, thank you so much for being here. Today we'll be presenting on case 12, the kindness of strangers. To start off with the question, is it morally justifiable for employers to rely on customer tips as a means of employee compensation? Why or why not? We believe that no, it is not morally justifiable for employers to rely on customer tips because there are inherent harms in tipping culture and because everyone is entitled to a living wage, and tipping is not a means that can ensure that. Brief summary, this case discusses tipping culture, and tipping is when customers give additional cash beyond their check to supplement the employee's low wage. These wages can be as low as $7.25 as operated by the federal government, and as well as the U.S. Department of Labor allows employers to pay as little as $2.13 per hour. So that I'll pass it on for our first rule mention.
Thank you. So the first kind of lens that we looked through this case through is the harms of tipping culture and how our current tipping culture in America does not benefit employees or consumers. The only person who really benefits from this type of transaction, this type of wage, is employers. So basically how federal law works currently is that any employee, whether it be a server or bartender, those are the ones we think of most commonly, this also includes hotel staff, could include hairdressers, nail artists, anyone who gets tipped. Legally, an employer can get away with paying an employee as low as $2.13 per hour if they make $30 in tips per month. Not per week, not per paycheck, per month. And we believe that this is just a drastically low amount of money that no person deserves to make. Additionally, I want to talk about a little bit of the history of tipping culture and how it came to be. Tipping originally started in feudal Europe as a way for monarchs and oligarchs to distinguish themselves from the working class. It was kind of a way of saying, I have extra money, I'm wealthy, you are below me, so I'm going to throw some money at you to show my status, show my class. And then it was adopted in America after the Civil War and the abolishment of slavery because previous slave owners did not want to pay newly black citizens for their work and argued with the government that they could live on tips alone, so they could get away with not actually paying them a wage. And every other country who has had tipping culture in the past has largely done away with it because there is some sort of recognition that asking consumers and customers to pay the wage of employees is not ethical. Both asking someone to pay the wages of a stranger and also asking an employee to act a certain way or rely on strangers to pay their wages. Harms of having strangers be responsible for paying their wages can take many forms, as personal bias or discrimination can also play a part in how someone tips you. It doesn't matter necessarily how good someone's service may be. If someone has a personal bias against their server, their bartender, or the staff, they just may not feel like tipping is worth it, and this can impact wages. And especially because 70% of the service industry, again, restaurants, bars, hotels, that kind of thing, is 70% female, which can lead to women feeling like they have to dress up or act a certain way, or even put up with abuses from customers in order to still gain a tip if they're relying on it for a wage. Through tipping alone, restaurants are required to compensate them for the difference. So if I work 40 hours a week and I don't make what I would make if I was making minimum wage as a server, for example, then my restaurant would have to pay me the difference. And so under current tipping culture. And we believe that while this is good now, we don't believe that it's enough to ensure that workers are still being compensated fairly, because even the federal minimum wage of $7.25 we don't believe is a good enough wage for people to really make a living on. And to talk more about that, I'm going to pass it on to my team member Gianna to.
Alright, so for our second moral dimension, we believe in a right to a livable wage. A livable wage, in the way that we're talking about it, is a wage that ensures that every worker can afford basic necessities such as food, housing, healthcare, and transportation. While the United States is not unique in this issue, the UN does recognize a livable wage as a fundamental human right as declared in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The current minimum wage in the United States is $7.25, which often does not account for inflation or changing cost of living. This has been the minimum wage wage for a very long time. Not only does $12 not hold the same value in higher cost of living areas as it does in cheaper, lower cost of living states, but many states, we believe that the federal, on a federal level, it should be regulated so that states have to set a minimum wage as some form of percent of cost of living for that state to kind of account for this. And while many states are typically taking that cost of living into account when they do set the statewide minimum wage, we believe that because employers can, in the service industry and in other industries, can kind of get away with paying these low minimums when it comes to service jobs, we believe that it should be federally regulated to some degree, that the minimum wage does need to be a percentage of the cost of living. And with that being said, if that is set, then more demanding jobs would have to pay higher rates, so everything would kind of even out in that way. And for some counters, I'm going to pass it over.
Thank you. So one counter argument one might posit is that tips motivate good service. Tips, the tipping system, allow consumers more agency over their dining experience or experience with other service industries. We think that while tips do exist as a strong motivator, servers, if paid a livable wage, would have a lot stronger motivations internally to provide that good service. It would be the expectation that if they are being compensated by their employers, they would naturally be providing this good service. And even if there isn't that internal motivation, it would be motivated by performance reviews and managerial reprimands for poor service. Additionally, one might argue that as these livable wages are implemented, prices for services would start to be going up if the servers are being paid more. And yes, this would happen. Prices on restaurant menus and other services would go up. But ideally, these price increases would match the same price that you would be paying if the tips were implemented into the amount anyway. So you would be paying ideally the same amount, and you would understand while you're paying upfront the amount that you would be paying. Additionally, in a lot of situations where these price rises are rising, they are disproportionate to rises in both minimum wage and they outpace inflation. And we think that in situations like these, we would like to implement anti-price gouging legislation to prevent exploitation of consumers by some of these service industries. For a final counter, one might say that some businesses could not afford this kind of wage. Even with price increases, they would not be able to afford to pay their employees. And we would argue that if a business cannot afford to pay its employees a living wage, then it is not a sustainable business model and should not continue existing in that format. And with that, I will pass it off for our conclusion.
Great. So to kind of just wrap it up, in response to the question of, is it morally justifiable for employers to rely on customer tips as a means for employee compensation, we would believe that no, it's not morally justifiable. There are inherent harms in tipping culture. And more than that, everyone is entitled to a livable wage. The tipping culture has a long history of being used as a tool to demean and neglect those that need funds the most, keeping them in a state of reliance and mental servitude as well as physical servitude. Currently, this especially negatively affects women, who make up 70% of the serving industry. We know that everyone has a right to a livable wage, as is defined by every worker can afford basic necessities such as food, housing, healthcare, and transportation. Things like Maslow's hierarchy tell us that these basic necessities are absolutely fundamentally necessary for someone to be able to thrive in life. And as employers, it is their responsibility to make sure that those people have that. We know that minimum wage should be a percentage of the cost of living to make sure that the right to the livable wage is upheld. Ultimately, we as a culture need to show our appreciation to servers and other individuals who rely on tips, not by tipping them individually ourselves, but by pushing employers to support their employees as they earn a livable wage, which they all have a right to. And with that, we see the rest of our time. We look forward to hearing the rest of our questions.
Well, first off, I'd just like to thank you guys for your case, for taking your points into consideration. And I'd just like to start with a brief recap of your case and adding a few points of my own that I would like to hear if you would like to add that to your case according to your framework. And then I have a few questions and concerns that I'd like to address about your case. So first off, in answering the question, you answered no, because of the inherent harms in tipping culture and that the assumption that everyone is entitled to a livable wage. I think that's great. You went on to address the history and the inherent bias in a lot of these cultures, and pointed out that these cultures are predatory to women, which I think is really great to point out. And I would like to hear if you'd like to adopt this into your case. We find that in these restaurants, there is a 90% of service workers who are women facing sexual assault. That's what they report. And a 4.5% increase of sexual assault to women in these restaurants, more than any other industry. So in your case, would increasing the livable wage and getting rid of tipping culture remedy this issue? And if not, how would you remedy that issue in your case? I'd also like to point out that you guys brought up that tips should be compensated to match the livable wage, which is what employers are supposed to be doing right now. Under the Obama administration, they found that employers were misreporting this at an 84% violation rate. So in your case, how do you remedy this? Are you getting rid of tips entirely? Are you holding employers to a higher scrutiny? Or are you just doing nothing at all? Next to some comments and concerns I have with your case. You brought up small businesses and how if they are not able to pay their workers, then maybe they should just not exist. But would this lead to just only big businesses and big restaurants leading the industry? I kind of have some concerns with that. How are small businesses supposed to start then? How are small restaurants supposed to get their feet off the ground? Just like they do the remedy, according to you guys. Next, something I'd like to question you on is, what about a cooling system? In many restaurants today, we have a system to where the employees will pool the tips together and then kind of spread it out, either to only the service workers or in some cases, the people working in the kitchen. So I'd just like to hear what your thoughts are on that. And 5 is kind of a big concern of mine. You brought up inflation, which I think is the biggest counterpoint to this case. It's what everyone is going to bring up when you're arguing, should we get rid of tips, should we get rid of tipping culture, and should we raise the wage? I'd just like to point out to a case study in Chicago, which is one of the first major cities that ever tried to get rid of tipping culture. And what they did is implement a 6-year process. So where at the start, all of their tipped workers would immediately begin earning $8 instead of that $2.13 price point, and then over 6 years, they would gradually increase that wage to $15. What they found is there was actually a decrease of inflation in the city of Chicago after that implementation. And of course, correlation does not equal causation, but they found that the service workers, since they were earning more money on average, they were able to put that money back into the economy. So I'd just like to hear if you would like other cities to kind of implement this gradual process, or if we should do something else in terms of raising the wage for these workers. And next, I'd like to bring up a big concern in terms of the practicality of this case, which is these big lobbying forces in government that are preventing the wage from being raised right now. After the city of Chicago successfully implemented this new tipping change, 20 cities tried to follow suit, and the National Restaurant Association shot them down. So how are we going to change the large lobbying forces in government to make sure that this doesn't happen again and that the cities can implement fair change as they want to? And with that, I'll pass it to Savannah.
Perfect. So thank you guys for your argument. I only had one question, and it was concerning your argument that the minimum wage should be federally mandated to be a percentage of the cost of living in a state. Coming from a state like Oklahoma, we do not have a lot going for us besides a low cost of living. So I want your opinion on if we are making minimum wage a percentage of the cost of living, would that not drive people away from smaller or more rural states like Oklahoma and instead to larger urban states? And with that, I will pass on to Brady.
Well, I don't have a whole lot of time, but I just wanted to expand on one of your counterpoints, specifically the one about motivation. I find selective motivation to be very interesting, and specifically, I wanted to kind of expand on the fact that when it comes to tipping culture, typically it actually reduces motivation. I don't have enough time to actually expand fully on my thoughts, so I think I'm going to leave it there. Thank you guys so much.
That's right, perfect.
Thank you so much for the points that you brought up, because you brought up some things that I wanted to touch on, but we didn't have enough time to. So I'll just jump right in. So first off, when employers don't actually compensate their workers properly, even though they are required to, sometimes they don't. So I'm a bartender. And I've worked at restaurants that do this, and the restaurant I work at does, and I've also worked at restaurants that didn't, and I didn't know that that was a right that I had to be properly compensated. And I think that absolutely, if we do continue down the road of tipping culture as we currently have it, it needs to be something that needs to be much more heavily regulated, and make sure that businesses are actually following federal mandates and doing what they're supposed to be doing and compensating their workers accordingly, especially when you have a lot of the service industry who are on the younger side and may not know that that's a right that they have to that further compensation. I also wanted to touch on your point about Chicago and their slow implementation of this, and I think that is a fantastic example. And again, I want to reiterate that we are one of the few countries in the world that still have this type of system, and I think that if we were going to move away from it, slow city by city implementation might be a more practical way to go about it, because as you said, it is beneficial when it happens. And I also wanted to touch on, again, that practicality aspect that you brought up, lobbyists and things like that. And I think that this is just a bigger overall governmental issue, not just about tipping, but about almost any issue that you could bring up. It is very unfortunate that big businesses have the money to pay people who are very good at arguing their points. They're very good at being lobbyists. They are very good at getting what businesses want. And businesses don't want to pay their employees, and that is unfortunately the reality that we have to contend with. And I think that, again, this is a larger governmental issue at large, and we would say that it falls back on politicians to not be able to be bought out, or we need to implement more laws or regulations or something that prevents this type of lobbying, because it is pervasive and it does prevent a lot of positive, good, moral legislation that would be beneficial to citizens to be passed. And I think that it is something that we need to contend with. And I'll pass it off to one of the teams.
Great. And you asked a big question about what about small businesses? And in terms of whether or not they're able to pay their employees a livable wage or stay open, we believe that all employees should be paid a livable wage. However, small businesses not being able to pay that shouldn't be on the small business. It's a greater systemic issue. It's important that we put a greater funding towards grants and small business loans to encourage other entrepreneurs to begin more and more small businesses. This can also tie into exactly what you brought up in terms of Chicago. We know that Chicago's slowing of the inflation, as well as putting more money into that lower working class, we know that if workers have more money, they'll spend it on the level that they want to spend it, which is typically at small businesses, because those are the areas that they believe in financially supporting. So by offering further systemic support like grants and small business loans, we can continue to encourage small businesses to thrive while making sure that all of their workers still have a livable wage.
And I'll hit on the question towards the end about the motivation of workers. And I think that was a really good point you brought up about tipping culture potentially decreasing motivation. And I think that gets to the internal and external motivation of workers. If we're focusing on external means, usually that is going to be things that are not having that kind of strong force to compel you to be a stronger worker. If you feel like you have, as a worker, a stronger sense of fulfillment in your position, if you feel like you have that kind of agency at your work, you're going to have a higher job satisfaction, and you are going to be working harder to provide the service that makes you feel important.
All right, and then with that, I would also like to address your question about wouldn't a percentage of the cost of living drive people away from lower cost of living areas? And I think that no, it would kind of do the exact opposite. When the cost of living is set as a percentage, that would mean that when you live in a state with a low cost of living, it would also be a low minimum wage. But if you move to a state with a higher cost of living, it would equally it would be a high cost of living as well as a higher wage. So it would essentially even that out in a sense.
Last question I want to touch on in the last 10 seconds I have is you brought up about sexual assault and how it's very pervasive in the industry. And I think that getting rid of tipping culture, it's one of those just added cherries on top of women feeling like they have to perform to get tips.
That's time.
Hello everyone, thank you all for being here today. We'll be presenting on case 17, when good goes go bad. So just for a brief summary, this case discusses food waste and food insecurity. This is a major issue question, who should be held morally accountable for food waste that creates an environmental burden? We believe that producers, consumers, and distributors all should be held morally accountable. They should be using more effective measures that are conscious about their food waste and how it can impact the environment. And with that, I'll pass on to our first mention.
So for our first one mention, we will be looking at this case through the lens of localized food distribution. So to define localized food distribution, we would be considering how we can balance the need for safe and fresh food at a wider scale with societal and environmental responsibilities to sustainability. So we will be considering this through, again, three lenses: the producers, the distributors, and also the lens of the waste that is produced in the end. So to start off with, the problems on the production end tend to come from the highly industrialized way that we practice agriculture in our current economy, both domestically and worldwide. One of the main issues with this is our major emphasis on animal agriculture. Because of the emphasis on animal agriculture, we use a lot of agricultural space that could be dedicated towards feeding humans directly to feeding animals, both for meat, for dairy, for other livestock purposes, which is highly inefficient in the use of our resources. We think that this is one of the major problems that contributes to food waste because we are in itself not using our resources efficiently to create the maximum benefit from what we have in terms of our natural resources. Another problem on the producer end is the lack of localized agriculture. So in the current system, especially domestically in the United States, the vast majority of our food comes far, far away from the areas that we live in. It's extremely distant, and that causes additional problems with resource consumption, with transportation of these foods. Problems with the distributor side look like areas like supermarkets and other areas throwing things out before their due best by dates, not clearly marking best by dates, and making it inaccessible for consumers to have a greater understanding of when food can be accessed safely and freshly. On the issues of waste, we might consider some of the problems with the inequitable distribution of waste. One of the reasons that this becomes such a problem is that, again, getting into distributors, this food is not allocated correctly. It creates the issue of food deserts, and it creates the issues of food insecurity and towards waste. One of the problems that people don't recognize is that the waste they are producing does not usually go to them. One major example of this is in Ocean City, Maryland. All of the waste, every single bit of trash, every piece of food thrown away is transported to incinerators in Chester, Pennsylvania, a historically disadvantaged and brown and black community that has to deal with the problems of these landfills and these incinerators, and this is represented across the country. We see constant issues with the issues of waste being generated by certain areas and being transported to other areas, so people are not directly aware of these issues of waste because they don't have to handle the problems. This is also an issue globally, especially with the United States. The amount of waste that we send and distribute to other countries is a major problem. So what do we do about these problems? We would suggest localized food distribution as a major source of fixes for these issues. So on the producer's end, to fix this industrial agriculture system, we would like to move towards a more optimal uses of our resources so we are generating less waste in general. We would be focusing not on feeder crops for animals, but on food that is the most calorically dense, provides the adequate nutrition for the people of our country, and is able to support us individually. We would also press for more localized agriculture in the terms of, instead of getting our food from all the way across the country, whenever accessible, getting food from localized areas. This could look like agriculture of natural crops that are endemic to the area being grown and farmed for local areas, in areas around cities, perhaps centralized agriculture in that way. But in certain areas, this becomes a problem when you consider how can we do this for large cities, large urban areas, and our answer to that is more of an emphasis on both rooftop gardens, using dead space that is not being accessed in this way, and having these areas in the urban cities dedicated towards food production for the people who live in them. On distribution issues, we would be focusing on eliminating areas like food deserts, making food more accessible to more people without having to travel great distances. And in terms of waste, we would advocate for these waste distribution systems to not only shift away from ideas like incinerators and landfills towards things like composting and shifting away from just throwing away our trash but instead gaining more use out of it, to also additionally having this waste localized so we can better see the impacts of it and compel us to not create as much of these problems. With that, I'll pass it to our second moral dimension.
Alright, so for our second moral dimension is personal environmental temperance. So environmental temperance is the virtue of living within the Earth's sustainable limits. We believe that virtues such as prudence, temperance, and gratitude can help us achieve this goal. What this requires from us on a personal level is to reduce consumption, have a sort of take what you need mentality, and a change of mindset. Earth is not here for our consumption, but for our cohabitation. Food waste is such a prominent issue in the United States because of the way we view our relationship with food. In the US, 40% of food ends up getting wasted. That is because we have a culture of convenience or immediacy. We expect to walk into the grocery store and see the freshest summer vegetables in the middle of winter. And maybe there are several steps that we could take to address this. But first, we need to kind of live within the Earth's sustainable limits. If we don't have access to these fresh vegetables, maybe that's something we have to convince ourselves we don't need it all the time. How do we address this on a practical level? We believe that we can address this with the use of injunctive norms. So injunctive norms presents norms as either approved or disapproved by society and encourages people to implement positive behavior that aligns with approved behaviors. So an example of this is if we change the way society views good and bad in relation to this food waste, we can change personal values and actions. So in South Korea, they have a yellow bag policy for food waste. So when you dispose of any food, you get rid of it in a yellow trash bag. And it is a pay-to-waste system. But the value that I find in this, personally, is that it keeps us socially aware and socially accountable for how much food we are wasting. Other solutions include misfit markets. So sometimes a lot of food gets wasted just because it's not the right color or it's not as appealing of a shape. And we think that if we kind of scale that back and say, no, this food is still good and we should still value this food, then we can increase how grateful we are towards this food and we can reduce waste. Another kind of solution to this is Best Buy and guaranteed fresh dates, which are not the same as expiration dates, even though in our minds we kind of view it the same way. So by educating about how, just because the expiration or the guaranteed fresh date has passed, it doesn't necessarily mean that the food is no longer good, just merely protection for the company itself. And with that in mind, I will pass it over to some practice.
Thank you. So I just want to touch on a few alternative viewpoints for this case. One being other plant kind of advocated moving away from large-scale animal agriculture for the purpose of meat production because of the amount of space and resources that it takes to feed that livestock for consumption. But this is a similar problem with other plant-based options such as soy or rice. They take up a massive amount of space to grow, a lot of water to produce and flourish, and to that we would say that yes, they do. But we also believe that this is a more ethically justifiable use of space and water because this is going most of the time directly to human consumption, not to feed animal livestock, which again is used have entire fields of plants being used just to simply feed meat that could be going straight to human tables. Another point of contention is, as a consumer, as the person paying for these goods, is it not my right to have whatever fruit or vegetable I want whenever I want it, even if it is out of season? And to that, we would say that although this is a very valid concern for consumers, it goes back to our culture of convenience. Especially in America, I feel that we are very entitled to certain things because we feel that we have the money to pay for it, we should kind of get whatever we want. And we would like to move away from this mindset because we don't believe that it's conducive to having a society where we appreciate the food that we do have and do have access to, and focus on more seasonal types of foods that we can incorporate into our diets. They're just as beneficial as, say, wanting a watermelon in the dead of winter, and I'll pass it off. So.
Right. Ultimately, we believe that it is on the producers to limit the harms of food waste by minimizing the harms of production itself. That includes localized food production, producing crops that are local to your area, as well as not mass farming all around. We believe that by encouraging the virtue of temperance, society as a whole will be less wasteful.
Thank you for your presentation.